Episode, let's talk about the Sabbath day. So in Genesis 2:3 it says, Elohim blessed the seventh day and made it holy or set apart. He distinguished it because he finished his work of creation and rested. So we see that the Sabbath was established all the way back in Genesis. What's interesting to me is this shows me that even before the nation of Israel existed, before Moses, before Mount Sinai, there has always been a seventh-day Sabbath. So Sabbath precedes Moses, precedes Israel, precedes the covenant on Mount Sinai. So the Sabbath was all the way back in the creation account, according to Genesis. Okay? What's interesting too is in the Ten Commandments, the fourth commandment is to remember the Sabbath day. It's the only commandment that starts with the word remember. Now, if we believe in the other commandments, how come the Sabbath isn't there? I've heard people say things like the Sabbath is ceremonial law. Well, if the Sabbath is ceremonial law, why is it mentioned in the Ten Commandments? And if it's true that the Sabbath is ceremonial law, why are the other 9 commandments not ceremonial law? Why is honor your father and mother not ceremonial law? Why is thou shalt not commit adultery not a ceremonial law? But somehow only the Sabbath is a ceremonial law. Does that make logical sense? To me, it does not. So let's continue on. A verse that people will often say that proves that the Sabbath is broken is in the New Testament when Yahshua's disciples were going through the grain field on the Sabbath and were plucking and eating. I'll have all the verses below in the comment section so you can read that in the description. But the Pharisees accused them of breaking the Sabbath. Now what's interesting, it was the Pharisees that accused them of breaking the Sabbath, because there is no biblical command that says you cannot pluck grains and eat on the Sabbath. But again, this was the Pharisees' interpretation of what the Sabbath was because they had their own rules and regulations on what they thought was and was not allowed on Sabbath. And you can read many debates about how the Messiah debates them, saying, they break the tradition of Elohim, of the Creator, because of their traditions. So you're going to see this constant battle of the traditions of the Pharisees versus what the Bibles or the Scriptures say. And when Yahshua broke Pharisaical tradition, in their mind, it was like as though he broke biblical tradition, but he simply broke the man-made rules that the religious leaders created. It'd be no different today than if you went against a popular church tradition that you found to be false. People may accuse you of not following the truth or, defiling the tradition of our forefathers, but you're not breaking biblical commands. You're simply breaking the commands that humans have created, which have no authority. So let's continue on. One of the examples he uses with them on this whole debate on eating grain on the Sabbath was King David ate the consecrated bread. In the temple, the priests performed work on the Sabbath, yet are innocent. Hosea 6:6 says, he desires mercy over sacrifice. And he also calls himself the master of the Sabbath. Okay, and he mentions, in other accounts that if an ox fell into a ditch on the Sabbath, would they not get it out? So the whole context here was they're doing the Creator's work, and they were simply eating on the Sabbath. They were plucking grains and eating them. They were not breaking the Sabbath. Because certain work is permissible on the Sabbath when you're doing it for the Creator. Okay? And so when it says to cease from work, it has the context referring to our typical work. So if you have a job, obviously you're not going to work on your job on the Sabbath day. But in this context, they're doing the Creator's work and they're simply eating grains. They're plucking them and eating them. So they were not breaking the Sabbath. Again, they were breaking the traditions that the Pharisees created about the Sabbath. And in addition to that, the Messiah calls himself the master of the Sabbath. If he was abolishing the Sabbath in that verse, as many will claim, how could he then call himself the master of the Sabbath if he was doing away with the Sabbath? Is he the master of a day now that doesn't exist? Can you be a master of that which doesn't exist anymore? Doesn't make any sense when you add it all up into context. But let's continue on. In Deuteronomy 23:25, passing travelers were permitted to pluck grain with their hands to satisfy hunger. So again, when you relate this into the context of if a passing traveler was allowed to do this, how much more so should the Messiah's men be allowed to do so? So let's look on. Luke 6:7. It says, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Yahshua, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Luke 6:7. So you see, in their mind, even healing someone on the Sabbath is equivalent to breaking the Sabbath. That's how far gone their minds were. And in Luke 6:9, he says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or evil, to save life or to destroy it? So he brings up this question, should we not be allowed to do good on the Sabbath day? And in Luke 6:10, if you read, he heals the man with a withered hand. And in Luke 6:11, it says the religious leaders were furious. So again, they're so concerned about rules and traditions they created that they're not even looking at this miracle. The man with a hand with an issue was healed. but rather they're upset because it was done on the Sabbath. This shows you how far gone their minds were. So, he never broke the Sabbath, he simply broke the traditions that the Pharisees created regarding the Sabbath, not the biblical Sabbath itself. If you want to say he broke the Sabbath when he was alive, then he was in fact a sinner and he'd be unqualified to be the perfect sacrifice. Because many will say, oh, well, he changed the Sabbath when he died. Okay, let's go with that thought. Well, when he was alive, then the Sabbath was still fully enforceable. So you can't say in this account he was breaking the Sabbath before he died, before he supposedly changed everything, right? So again, doesn't make sense when we add it all up into context. Let's continue on. In Luke 23:56 it says, and they returned and prepared spices and ointments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. This is talking about the early followers, the women of the Messiah. So even though this was after his death, they wanted to go out, they did not, because it says they rested in obedience to the command of the Sabbath. Remember, this is after he died. So even after he died, there's still obedience to the command of keeping the Sabbath. How could that be if after he died the Sabbath was nailed away and destroyed? Doesn't make any sense. Why would they be resting in obedience to the command? And how could you even have a command if the command was done away with? It doesn't make any sense. In Acts 17:2, it says, as his custom was, Paul went into the synagogue, and on the Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures. You can read Acts 17:2 for the exact translation of that. But again, Paul's custom was to reason in the synagogues on the Sabbath days, not on Sunday, on the Sabbath days. That's another topic I'll get into. Was the Messiah risen on a Sunday? Which I'll show he wasn't, but I'll make a part 2 on that. But the point is, how could he be doing this custom of preaching on the Sabbath days in the synagogues if there is no Sabbath day to even preach on? Doesn't make sense. Let's continue on. Acts 13:14, Acts 13:42 through 44, Acts 16:13, and Acts 17:2, and Acts 18:4 all talk about Paul and the Sabbath. And what's really interesting, in Acts 13:42, it says the Gentiles asked, this is how the King James translates it, that these words be preached to them on the next Sabbath. And in many of the accounts you read about how he preached to Jews and Gentiles. So some people say, oh, he was only keeping the Sabbath to reach the Jews. Then why were the Gentiles there, and why didn't Paul correct them and explain to them that they were worshiping on the wrong day? But that's not the context that you find. And I'll prove why even more so here. In Acts 15:20, there is a debate amongst a lot of the Gentiles coming in about what rules they should be following. And this is what it says here in Acts 15:20. They're to abstain from food polluted by idols, sexual immorality, from meat of strangled animals, and from blood. So food from idols, you can find that in Exodus 34:15. Sexual immorality, you can find in Leviticus 20. Strangled animals, you can find in Leviticus 17:13 through 14. And eating of blood, you can find in Deuteronomy 12:23 through 25, and Genesis 9:4. So what's really interesting is these rules the Gentiles are given are actually Old Testament commands. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you read Acts 15:21, it says, for the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times, and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. So why even mention Moses in the synagogues on the Sabbath if we're talking about the Gentiles in Acts? This is because what they're saying essentially is these new Gentiles need to give up these major issues, these major sins. Sexual immorality, eating of blood, eating strangled animals because the blood remains in them, and from food polluted by idols. When they come to the synagogues on the Sabbath, they will learn the rest of the law. It's kind of like if someone's coming into your congregation or your group and they've got a major drinking problem. You've got to solve that drinking problem first rather than worrying about whether they wear a tie or nice clothes to service. That's a secondary issue. So these are the major issues that Gentiles have. For those who want to say, well, these are the only things that Gentiles need to worry about, I want you to think about it like this. Those who usually believe the Sabbath was done away with also believe the food laws were done away with, right? But here we have in Acts, food laws still being enforced. Don't eat blood and don't eat strangled animals. That shouldn't matter if the food laws don't exist anymore, right? But yet here we have this command to do so years later after the death and resurrection of the Messiah. So with that same context, it's like, well, how could the food laws still be applied here, but then we're going to say that the Sabbath is not applicable? Does that make any sense? But let's continue on. Another popular verse is in Romans 14, where it says, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully persuaded or convinced in his own mind. So if you read the whole context of Romans 14, it's not actually talking about Sabbath keeping. Because if you read the whole Romans 14, and it mentions about those who eat so to the master, and those who refrain from eating, do so unto the master. So it's like, why are we mentioning eating here if this is about the Sabbath? That's because historically during this time, it was very common for people to fast. And because in this context, there is no verse that specifically says what day to fast, a person was fully able to do the day of fasting that they were convicted on in their own mind. This has nothing to do with Sabbath keeping. It has to do with days people are dedicating to abstain from eating food. And this is what the whole context is about. You can choose what day to fast because there is no command that says twice a week you should fast on these days. It just doesn't say that. So you can fully be persuaded and choose what days you choose to fast. And you can't judge another person for eating or not eating because, again, there is no command. You can't say this has something to do with Sabbath keeping and then read all the verses in Acts where Paul's custom was to keep the Sabbath, to read about how the Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments. And we read about how the Messiah's early followers, the women, still honored the Sabbath after his death, and then say, well, you can pick whatever day you want. Why all this emphasis on resting on the Sabbath, honoring the Sabbath, preaching on the Sabbath, but then pick whatever day you want the Sabbath to be? Does that even make any sense? The answer is no. So Hebrews 4:9 says, there therefore remains a Sabbath rest unto the people. I invite you to look up the Greek word rest in Hebrews 4:9. It comes from the Greek word sabbatismos, which means Sabbath keeping. Here's some notes I have. The NIV translates it as a Sabbath rest. The English Standard Version translates it as a Sabbath rest. The Berean Study Bible translates it as a Sabbath rest. The New American Standard Bible translates it as a Sabbath rest. So you get the context. Hebrews 4:9 is referring to there therefore remains a Sabbath rest. And again, why are we mentioning the Sabbath rest all the way in Hebrews if the Sabbath was done away with when the Messiah died? It does not make any sense. In future, let's go on. Isaiah 66:22 through 23 says, from one new moon to another and from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come and bow before me, says Yahweh. So if Isaiah 66:22 through 23 is prophetic in nature, and the Sabbath is going to be initiated in the future, why then wouldn't the Sabbath be for us today? So why would the Sabbath be blessed at creation, blessed during the time of Messiah, blessed during the time of Moses, kept during the time of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, supposedly done away with, but yet it's going to be reinstated in the future? Does that make any sense? And why is the Sabbath in the Ten Commandments, as I said before, if it's ceremonial, but the other 9 commandments are not ceremonial? In addition to that, if you read Zechariah 14:18, it's really interesting. It talks about in the future that if the families of Egypt or those of the nations do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, what is called a quote-unquote Old Testament celebration, they will receive the plague of no rain. I invite you to read Zechariah 14 through 18 about how the nations will be required to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, or in Hebrew what's called Sukkot. This is an Old Testament festival celebration you can find in the book of Leviticus. Yet here we are in the future, and people are going to be required to keep it. So how could these things be done away with? Yet in the future they're going to be done. Another great verse is 1 Corinthians 5:7 through 9. Paul's talking about celebrating the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And remember, this is in Corinth. And he says, I must by all means keep this feast. So let us keep this feast. So how could you by all means keep this feast, let us keep this feast, or use any language within that context about keeping this feast, this festival, this celebration, if that celebration is no longer needed or it's just symbolic? And remember, he's talking to people in Corinth, primarily Gentiles. Yet here he is talking about the Passover. And if you want to say, oh, he was only doing it so he could preach to the Jews because that's when he had the opportunity, again, that does not explain why in the future then the nations are going to be required to do what's called an Old Testament celebration of tabernacles. I'll have all the verses below, in the comment, not the comment section. I'll have these verses in the description. Look up all the verses. I could have said something incorrect, and it's up to you to seek what is true. Thank you so much for your time.